Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
전체의 사회 주기를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여 보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님 백성의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강성대국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여 보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님 매국의 뜻을 받들어 불굴의 정신력 그 대장으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조선 결심하면 한다. 조선 한다면 한다. Yagad negin artim tereg
Geldiğin dara gitti botsina Adancılık hançisem Adacimin hançisem Neşte bunyi zoste kovum Nerinci atar koyuşum
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. We are in the evening of December the 16th, 2024, and we are here today with a live stream, which is sort of a attempt to catch up with the disastrous technical failure from yesterday. So the focus of today will be on just finishing off things that I was going to play the video of the recording I did on the answering the questions I've received earlier yesterday, then come in with a Q&A, and due to the technical failures, we were unable to do that. So I'm going to start off by just saying a couple of things, mainly on the stories coming out about the potential negotiations between Russia and US imperialism over the war in Ukraine, because this has been kicking around today. The New York Times, of all places, ran a story about the end game in Ukraine and how the war could come to a close in next year, meaning, well, just a few weeks' time. So I'm just going to share that story with you because I want everybody to see what I'm talking about here. So there you go. Open admission in the article by this guy called Julian Barnes, I'm assuming is the usual kind of New York Times hack. And if you are wondering why I would bother reading New York Times, Washington Post, or any of the other bourgeois American papers, it's because you should always be aware of what the enemy is saying. And if you regard New York Times, Washington Post, any other imperialist rag, not as something which is meant to represent truth, but as something which is putting out certain lines that the US ruling class wants people to believe, or preparing the ground for something. And what this article is doing is preparing the ground for something. And what they're obviously preparing the ground for now, if you look at the map there, what they're preparing the ground for is whatever concession, should we say, or recognition of reality that Trump forces, or should we say US imperialism forces on the Kiev regime. So if you look at this map that the New York Times has published, New York Times will be being as generous as they can. Remember, they're using an ISW map here, Institute for the Study of War. If you're not familiar with who that is, they're the think tank founded by the Kagan family. Kagans are a notorious group of like reactionary and very, very reactionary intellectuals who have served US imperialism in various capacities for many, many years. Robert Kagan is, I believe, the husband of Victoria Nuland of Cookies in Maidan Square fame. So even the Institute for the Study of War, when publishing maps showing what Russia controls and what Ukraine controls, is obliged to admit that the amount of Russian territory held by Ukraine is that small. Just look at that. I mean, we could zoom in using the live map UA features, but there's no need really. It's a tiny amount of ground now, and the area around that has been completely surrounded. The Ukrainian troops there are close to getting cut off if they've not been already, meaning that this is going to be a casualty-heavy, total disaster for the Ukrainian side. Again, all planned by principally planners from Britain, mainly from Britain, with the US involved as well. So that's a total disaster. They're not going to be able to trade jack shit for that. They're not going to get anything. The Russians are just going to kill everybody in there until they surrender. And many, many are. Apparently, many of the Western trained troops are now surrendering, have been for quite some time. So there's no bargaining for whatever Ukraine thought they were going to get. The Ukrainians thought they were going to get by agreeing to this British plan to try and take what an operation that would have tried to take the Kursk nuclear power plant. So the demands made by the Russians, what are those? Now, there's various different speeches that have been made by Putin and Medvedev. Medvedev, as he always does, goes a bit further, saying, oh, well, we could have new regions joining us, etc. Putin's been talking a lot about Novorossiya. Now, Novorossiya, of course, traditionally refers to not only this area here held by the Russians, but this area that runs down traditionally to this borderland of Moldova and Romania. Now, that's been something which has been talked about a lot in various Russian circles for quite some time, the idea of taking all of this and essentially returning Ukraine to a coastless rump state. Whether the Russians will go for that or not, they're certainly hinting at it. But again, this could be the opening of some bargaining, we don't know. Now, I've said previously, and I said this when I expected the Biden regime to hang on to power somehow, because the strategy of the section of the U.S. ruling class that Biden represented was to keep the war going in Ukraine for as long as possible, using any means possible, short of directly committing U.S. forces. So hence the agreement to use the long-range missiles on Russian targets ineffectually, so far it must be said, largely ineffectually. Hence the agreement to pump more and more endless amounts of or as many military supplies as they can into Ukraine. Hence the pressure being brought on Zelensky to agree to lower the conscription age to 18. I'm surprised they haven't done it already. All for one purpose and one purpose only. And that is, of course, to make the war as costly and brutal as possible for the Russians, make sure that they pay as heavy a price as possible in blood and treasure by sacrificing the lives of ultimately millions of Ukrainians and killing that nation stone dead. Now, I'm reminded of a quote from Capital Volume 1, where it's a quote from another book that Marx is using, where he says that, well, the quote says that for capital expansion, for the prospect of capital being expanded, there's absolutely no crime that the bourgeoisie won't commit. There's no limit. When the prize is as big as it is in this game they're playing, there's no crime that they wouldn't commit to secure it. The only thing that will ever stop them would be fear of potential opposition in their homelands and potential disturbances that could lead to their overthrow. That's the only thing that would stop them. And even then, that's only restraining them, not stopping them entirely. But in terms of what they do to Ukraine, there's no limit. And that's what I was, when I was considering the likely outcome of this, and I was saying that the US is likely to try and force the Russians to fight all the way to Kiev and beyond. This is what I was considering, that this was the policy the administration was going to follow. Now, if Trump, or I should say more accurately, the section of the American ruling class that Trump represents, he's going to approach this differently, then we need to consider how this will be the case. How will they approach it differently? So is it going to be the case, as has been intimated by some, that Trump will force Ukraine, or just tell the Russians that, don't worry, I've spoken to Mr. Z. It's all over. He's going to Florida. He's going to be on with that nasty guy, Stephen Colbert. Are they going to basically tell Zelensky, show's over, Russia gets at least the 4 regions, which means you have to hand over the rest of Zaporozhye and Kherson and whatever is left in Donetsk, the Donetsk People's Republic that the Russians haven't conquered yet. You need to give up all of that and basically agree to no NATO, probably no EU, heavy demilitarization in return for certain security guarantees. And does Trump then, or whoever's doing the thinking for Trump, then just dump the entire problem on the EU and refocus on trying to make a war on China, which would be a much, much more difficult prospect, or trying to make a war on Iran? Again, a very difficult prospect. At the moment, I'm not sure. We'll see what kind of negotiation that Trump will commit to, or that his faction will commit to. But if the plan is to dump the whole thing on the Europeans and essentially bail out, then what tactics will the Russians adopt? Will they go for a maximalist approach, or will they be cautious? Everything I have come to believe about the Russians, about the Russian system, indicates to me that they will still be exercise an element of caution. They will have to insist that they will get the rest of Zaporozhye and Kherson, but I think that the hierarchy of the Russian system will consider things in a more comprehensive fashion. Let us consider for a moment, what are the likely scenarios if the US administration under Trump essentially forces Zelensky's hand and says, you're done, give them those regions, we'll guarantee that you don't face a direct invasion by the Russians, but your you're finished for in terms of NATO membership. We're holding it off for at least a generation. The Russians will insist that that means that NATO membership is off the table in perpetuity. Trump probably won't commit to that. He'll probably come up with some sort of fudge, and there'll be a lot of haggling over it. But let's assume for a moment that no NATO, maybe no EU, but that could be that might be haggled over. Well, let's assume that even if for a moment that the Russians agree to a remnant Ukraine joining the EU, the Hungarians and the Slovaks might block it, just as the Hungarians and the Slovaks have blocked the sanctions on Georgia. A sensible move from their point of view. So let us assume for a moment that the Russians get all that bit in red that they've got on the moment, plus the remaining parts of the 4 regions that voted to join Russia overwhelmingly, plus Crimea, that they get the rest of Zaporozhye and Kherson, and the rest of Ukraine remains nominally independent but gets demilitarized, has to essentially disassemble the Banderite regime that was built after 2014, though really since 2004. They've been building it for 20 years, and they're forced to, at least on paper, disassemble that. Then we need to consider what version of Ukraine this will be. It will be a Ukraine that is essentially dead, because let's be clear, there will be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of casualties. We still will not know the full amount that have died for quite some time yet, because there's no way that the Ukrainians will have kept accurate records about it. I don't think they will. And they'll be covering up an awful lot of deaths by declaring that there are thousands of men missing. So it'll take the war ending and quite some time afterwards before full accounting comes out. But the bulk of the fighting age men will either be dead or fled by then. Those refugees that fled to Europe, to Western Europe, won't be going back. The ones that fled to Russia might go back to the stabilized 4 regions. They stand a much better chance of building a new life for themselves there on the territory that used to be called Ukraine. The ones who fled to the west won't want to go back, even if they're working in some shit job in Manchester or London or France or in Germany somewhere. They still won't want to go back, not to that version of Ukraine, which will be a basket case, because it will be, unless the US and the Europeans are prepared to forgive it its debts, which are very substantial. I'm putting together another show for later in the week on debt burdens, on the country's debt burdens, because it's very interesting to go through and just see how much these subjugated neo-colonies owe. It's a very crucial tool for the imperialists of control, the debt burden. If rump Ukraine is left hundreds of billions in debt, we're having lost most of the productive industry that was left in the country. So having lost all of a lot of the steel and coal and other heavy industry that was still present in the Donbass. Remember, much of the rest of Ukraine was asset stripped in the 90s and 2000s. It was the Donbass that survived as a site of heavy industry. So what's left of Ukraine is going to be a deindustrialized, principally rural and agricultural place, in which most of the land is owned by foreigners, various different big corporate landowners like ECH Capital and others, which is governed by a very unstable regime in Kiev, which is going to be something which is imposed really by, an agreement reached by the West and the Russians, mainly by the Americans and the Russians, of some sort of neutral government that is acceptable to both parties. Good luck finding that, but assume for a moment that they do. This will be an incredibly unstable regime that, again, can't have any room for maneuver because it's mired in debt. Even if the door is kept open to the EU, I doubt many EU countries will even want Ukraine in the EU. There is, of course, the possibility that the Germans, and again, go and listen if you're not familiar with what I'm about to speak about regarding German imperialism. go and watch the interview I just did with the two comrades from the communist organization in Germany, because we were talking a lot about the agenda of German imperialism. So maybe German imperialism has some plans for this rump Ukraine, which is why they're building up their military capacity, or at least they're trying to. They might not succeed. But it'll be an absolute basket case, can't be presented as independent. And if it's demilitarized as well, it'll mean that the value of it lies purely in its agricultural land, which will mean that there'll be a lot of hungry imperialist eyes focused on basically running it as a puppet state and a source of cheap agricultural labor, which will mean it'll be all the bullshit promises of the great European Euro-Atlantic future that all those professional liars in the NGO world told Ukrainians about will all just prove to go up in smoke. The only jobs there will be connected to working on the land, and that won't be a gigantic amount of employment. So you'll end up with another migration wave in a country which is essentially dying on its feet. So the calculation made by the Russians, perhaps if I'm right about their thinking, will be that they can comprehensively do a rebuild job on the 4 regions they've got right now, plus Kherson City, rest of Zaporozhye region. And they can do so in a way that attracts outward investment, principally, I would say, from the Chinese. And they can do a rebuild job like they've done in Mariupol, which brings back residents who have fled, brings in people who'd fled into Russia at the beginning of the war, maybe even brings in people from what was once Western Ukraine to resettle there. So the Russians can do a pretty good job, I would guess, rebuilding those areas. The problem that they would be faced with if they tried to take all of Ukraine, which I thought that at one stage they might have to, even if they appointed like a Ukrainian government in exile to rule in Kiev rather than swallowing the whole thing themselves, was that they'd get essentially stuck with the bill of repairing this. And I don't think the Russians really want to do that, even if the Chinese invested heavily, which they might do, even if other nations chose to make some investments. It'd still be a huge bill to pay. And you'd still be left with an awful lot of Banderites roving around in the west of Ukraine, who are going to be there for quite some time anyway. So would they then choose to essentially pause the game here? And what I mean by that is rebuild these areas, use them essentially as showpieces as to what Russia could do. And at the same time, perhaps the better game would be to aid those resistance movements in Western Ukraine against the remnants of Banderism or whatever regime is imposed in Kiev, and essentially wait for this indebted neo-colony that the Kiev regime will turn into to fall apart. Risky strategy, of course. Many will argue that the Russians' tactics of freezing the conflict in Syria and having the terrorist enclave in Idlib ultimately bit them on the arse. But this is a different country to Syria. And the Russians aren't likely to retreat from areas that are now considered essentially part of the Russian Federation. We'll have to see how this pans out, but I can see why the Russians would be cautious about swallowing more of the territory of the former Ukraine now. I can equally see how the appeal of going all the way down the coast to the borders of Moldova and Romania is something which is a very real and powerful force inside Russian politics right now, given that the Russians have 1 million men in the field, apparently, or 1 million men available in the combat zone. They're far outnumbered, the Ukrainians now. The NATO forces aren't coming anytime soon. In fact, I doubt that they could even summon up the fabled 100,000 strong peacekeeping force. But we will see. Is it the case that, as my comrade and friend Kit Klarenberg has said, that the US is basically prepared to pull the rug out from under the Kiev regime? And if so, are they going to pull the rug in a way that will satisfy the Russians' demands? If they do, then I can see why the Russians would hold off on their more maximalist ambitions and essentially wait to see what happens, given that it is likely that the US won't want to spend much money in Ukraine and what's left of Ukraine. That all will happen is that value will be extracted from Ukraine. It'll be sucked dry by the vampires from the West. And then once the husk is bone dry, then they will likely abandon it for real in a few years' time, or it becomes too problematic for them. And now there may be an attempt by German imperialism, British imperialism, French imperialism, with their sympathizers in the United States, to rearm and re-equip this version of Ukraine and try and go for another war. There'll be those in the West that certainly want to do that. I have a feeling, though, that when this comes to an end, that there will be a lot of bitter recriminations inside whatever is left of Ukraine, and that this may be Banderism's last waltz, because the full truth, as I said, will eventually come out about how many men were killed, about how many were killed also by the Nazi punishment battalions, about how many died needlessly. And the Maidan regime and all those associated with it will be politically toxic inside Ukraine for a very, very long time, probably for maybe even longer than the World War II Banderites were. So these things are all up in the air at the moment. I wanted just to come on and air my thoughts about that. I'm literally in two minds at the moment as to how this is going to go. We will see if Trump is committed to his pivot over to the east, which will be equally disastrous, and so is prepared to pull the rug on the Kiev regime. The risk there, of course, is that if he does pull the rug on the Kiev regime and tells the Europeans, right, your problem now, then there is the distinct risk that what he will get in Ukraine is not an orderly handover to the unwilling so-called partners in the EU, but a speedy collapse of the Kiev regime into squabbling factions who will start shooting each other. Because the only thing that's really holding this regime together at the moment is the endless aid given to it by the United States, by the endless payoffs coming from the US and the Europeans and the British. If that stops or it's interrupted, or if the fragile balance of forces inside Kiev in the figure of Zelensky is removed, then a lot of these factions are going to start fighting each other like rats in a sack. So again, if Trump tries to bail on this, pulls the rug out, tells the Europeans to handle it, and the whole thing falls to pieces, it's not going to look particularly good for him either. Really now, imperialism doesn't have many good options. The Russians can, with the military force that they've built up and the successes that they've had in the industrial field now, afford perhaps to take a few risks with regard to the waiting for the complete collapse of the Kiev regime. But those risks, of course, are something which many in this Russian political system will not find acceptable. So we wait to see how much of the rug is going to get pulled here. So I will now turn to comments in the chat. So hello to all 303 of you who are watching at the moment. So be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already, and also be sure to subscribe on YouTube, on Twitch, on follow us on X, or subscribe on Rumble, follow us on Instagram as well, which is where we are broadcasting right now. So good evening to Albert, and to Mutanda, and to Luca, and to Nikolai, and to Thomas. Barry, hello to you, fellow resident of northwestern England. And Barry comes to us and says, won't surprise you that the Socialist Workers' Party, if you're not familiar with who they are, or they were at one stage, the leading Trotskyite group in Britain. The SWP, says Barry, welcomes the downfall of Assad, says the workers will now be empowered to get organized. Yes, if you're not familiar with the arguments made by the SWP, these are the same people who welcomed the fall of the Soviet Union and said that now was the time to fight for real socialism. Okay, I'm just going to check my watch. It's 33 years later now, lads. How is it going? Oh, right. Stalin was right. And when the collapse of the Soviet Union came, the workers around the world were quite literally, as he said they would be, seized by the throat. And we've had 30 years of the most pitiless reaction since then. So that went well. I'm sure their prediction of the workers becoming empowered now that Assad has gone is going to come true. I would ask our friends in the SWP, if you're watching, and I know some of you will be because you job share with MI5. How are the workers going to do much when a lot of the industry that did exist in the Syrian Ba'athist period, a lot of the industry is being burnt down and blown up. Some of it's being burnt down by random by criminal gangs in the employ of somebody. Some of it's being blown up by the US and blown up by Israel. How is the Syrian proletariat going to respond when most of the areas it used to work in have been destroyed and they're rendered unemployed? They're rendered they are rendered into an unemployed workforce, a big reserve army of labor. How is it going to go well for the Syrian proletariat when al-Julani, or whoever he is, he seems to have at least 3 names, and in more identities than a they-them college professor. How is it going to go when al-Julani, let's just use that name for him, turns to the free market model of which he apparently is so fond, and essentially allows US and European capital, and let us not forget Gulf state capital as well, to ransack and asset strip the Syrian economy in the same way that was done, by the way, by these same forces to the Ukrainian economy. How is that going to go? By the way, the SWP and all the other clowns denounced Putin, they denounce Lukashenko over and over and over again. But Lukashenko and Putin as well, but let's deal with Lukashenko first. Lukashenko preserved a good deal of the Soviet industrial legacy, and that's why he is hated. He also preserved, advanced the sovereignty of Belarus in a way that the Ukrainian compradors gave away Ukrainian sovereignty, and asset stripped the industrial base, destroyed it completely, and sold the country for pennies to the United States. That's what the Syrian compradors will be doing. They'll sell the country for pennies on the dollar to the United States, to the Saudis, to the Gulf states, to the Europeans. The British are throwing around a £50 million bribe now to open doors for themselves in Syria. That fat piece of crap, David Lammy, is going to probably go over there and dance a jig with al-Julani, probably. Maybe they'll do the sword dance together. But point being that this country is going to get asset stripped. That's what's going to happen. This is the standard play made by US imperialism. Asset strip everything, sell everything that's not nailed down, destroy the industrial base, and then turn the country into merely a site of resource extraction and make them entirely dependent upon imports. How is the destruction of the Syrian industrial working class, which is what is going to be done here? And again, this isn't speculation. This is what they do. They destroy the industrial base. They make the country dependent upon imports from their production centers. And they make sure that the country, now it's in their orbit, is cut off from Chinese or Russian investments. Chinese who, of course, do come to places and help to build an industrial base, by the way. So the question being then, well, how does that help the Syrian proletariat? Have our friends in the SWP asked this question? Have any of them? This is something, of course, that they never really want to explore, is it? Because it would reveal a fundamental problem in their assumptions, which is every time they've welcomed the downfall of what was once called actually existing socialism, and in the case of Baathism in Syria, what you would call like a form of left Arab nationalism, which did actually enact some industrialization and did have protectionist measures in place to protect its industries. With all of that gone, what replaces it? Again, it gets turned into a neo-colony. How does any of that help the Syrian worker? It doesn't. And if you actually outline this to a trot, most of them, as I would have been when I was a younger man and I was in a Trotskyite group, if you'd have outlined that, I wouldn't have known what to say, because you're not trained when you're a Trotskyite to learn what to say about that. Right. Hello to Alan. Hello to Kernio. Hello to Roman. Hello to Comrade Ian Foster. Mutanda says, random question has been niggling me this week. Assad seems to have been fooled by the Gulf states welcoming Syria back into the Arab League. Should Russia and Iran be extremely wary of them? The Gulf states? Definitely. Well, those guys are, first of all, these are comprador regimes that were set up by British and US imperialism. Those families that rule the Gulf states, they're all extremely close to the British, especially the British, but also the US. These guys who rule the UAE, who rule places like Oman, places like Qatar, and of course Saudi Arabia itself. These are all characters who are maneuvered into place by the British. They own a lot of property in Britain. They do a lot of business over here. They keep a lot of money over here. So they are, with license, I think, from their masters in Washington and London, positioning themselves to have kind of a foot in both camps. They're doing so in their own interest, but also acting as agents for the US and the Brits, making sure that BRICS has some people on the inside who know what's going on. And of course, these regimes are playing their own games as well, but they are definitely untrustworthy individuals. And you do business with them very cautiously, and you should never trust them, because look who their masters ultimately are. Look at the amount they've still got invested inside the US. Look at the amount of money they keep in Britain. It's a lot. Look at the amount of property that they got over here. It's a lot. Look at the amount of horse racing they do over here. Again, this is where they choose to keep an awful lot of their assets. Do we really think that these are people who are like all in on like the BRICS multipolar project, or are they in there for a combination of reasons, but in there with the license given to them by their masters in London and Washington? I think it's a lot of the latter. So when you've got these fake countries, really, a lot of the time, who are ruled over by these comprador oligarch princelings who have got so much bound up in the imperialist system, who maybe are a little bit smarter these days and are thinking they do want to spread their bets a little bit, but they're still bound into the imperialist system. Why trust them? Now, I don't think it's just simply a case of Assad suddenly believing them. I mean, again, I'll repeat what I said in the programs that I've done about Syria. Just boiling it down to the figure of Assad doesn't really work. Assad was the leader of a system. The Syrian Ba'ath Party being the premier player in that system, with other parties as well, but that was the ruling party, and with a hierarchy, some of whom are still there. Like some of that last Syrian administration appointed by Assad, some of them are still in place because they just switched sides. So there's more to this than just Assad being fooled by the Gulf states. It would seem to me that not only him, but the hierarchy in the government came to believe in the promises made by the Gulf states. The Gulf states were moving money into Syria, and they were probably making all kinds of promises that people chose to believe, as I've said before. So yes, to answer Mutanda's question, like Russia and Iran, right, the Iranians know very well what the nature of the Gulf states are. They took the Chinese-sponsored peace process with the with the Saudis because it was probably in the interests of both sides to avoid direct confrontation. Certainly in the interest of the Saudis, who would get destroyed by an Iranian reprisal against them if the US were to be launching strikes on Iran from Saudi territory. So I would say that you can have a peace treaty with somebody. It doesn't mean you should trust them. And you certainly shouldn't trust those guys. Absolutely the most treacherous bunch probably on the planet, though that's up against a lot of competition. But it all comes from the fact that these countries are creations of and creatures of imperialism to this day. Hello to Cobb Fan out in the far-flung reach of US imperialism that is of Western Australia. Edward, good evening to you. CJ Jackson, good evening to you. Red Chilean says, is this a do-over from yesterday? No, it's the Q&A with the audience that I was supposed to do yesterday after I played the video where I answered your question. But due to various technical fuck-ups, the video didn't play properly, so I just had to upload it. Ian Foster says, surely this article is imperialist wishful thinking. Well, probably is to a degree. Unconditional surrender is the only approximation to a permanent solution. Russia taking the whole of Odessa, Sumy, and Kharkov, the minimum for peace. Well, I would be, I mean, you may be right. I would say that the only doubt I would have about that would be if the Russians are considering the post-conflict world, and are they going to be, if they say to the Americans, look, show's over, we can win this thing, but we'd rather this just be brought to a conclusion, Donnie, Mr. President. So tell that clown in Kiev that it's over. Tell them that they're going to give up all the regions you mentioned there, Ian, and that they're going to basically surrender now, and we'll let them keep the middle part of Ukraine. And that will be, and then, you know, the Europeans can take responsibility for that. Now, will the Americans accept that? Some of them would probably say, shrug their shoulders and say, hey, fuck it, let's head to China. But there's going to be an awful lot of resistance inside the US state machine to that being the settlement, which would mean, I mean, given Trump's very dodgy administration, especially in its with the cabinet appointments that he's made, very much a bunch of the rabid American chauvinists. Are they going to go for that? I don't think they would be able to agree to it. I think so. If there's no agreement, let's just deal with this variable now. If there's no agreement, then what Ian says in his comment there may well end up being the case. If the Russians have to force a surrender, not via an agreement, but by dismantling the Kiev regime, then that is what they will ultimately have to do. I don't think that would be their first choice, because then they'd end up with the responsibility of, well, what do you do with the great middle part of Ukraine? What do you do with Western Ukraine? They may try to lure the Poles and others into exercising their historic claims, and making the west of Ukraine their problem. They may bring in a government from exile to rule the central part of Ukraine, as I've said before. That's all comes with a lot of cost and a lot of difficulties, though. I mean, the reason why I have my doubts about this is I think that some in the Russian government would draw the conclusion that dump the what's left of Ukraine onto the Europeans and let them try and digest it, because they won't be able to. So we'll see. If the US is serious about getting themselves out of it and basically just walking away, then they will agree to whatever terms the Russians put in front of them, as long as a version of Ukraine is temporarily preserved and they don't look as if they've lost. My suspicion is, though, that there'll be some negotiation. The negotiation will get undermined by those within the US and British and French and German states that don't want this to go ahead. And Trump won't have the wherewithal, neither will his senior leadership team, to persist with the negotiation. The war will drag on, and then we'll end up with some version of the more maximalist Russian demand, maybe in the middle of next year. If there's a negotiation, maybe the solution, the end of the negotiation will be more limited, and the Russians will think, well, we might just get away with letting the rest of Ukraine fall apart. Again, these all come with risks, though. So I don't have the definite answer at the moment. I'm still trying to work out exactly where this is going to go. But if it comes to a solution the Russians have to force on the battlefield, then yes, they're going to end up taking all of that coastline. But then they are presented with the problem of what to do with the rest of Ukraine, and we'll have to see what they do about that. David Stein says, do you know about Rena LU? Rena LU on X. Russian History News perspectives and from a Russian poverty. Not heard of that. I'll have a look at the account. Hello to Pavel, who joins us and says, greetings from a German national living in Austria. I started my journey towards Marxism 6 months ago. I tried to join the local communist organization, but they were unserious people. Was that the Austrian Communist Party that you tried to join? They did seem rather unserious from what I could tell. Hello to Enigma. Hello to Jenny, who's moderating for us tonight. Hello to Not a Pacifist. Hello to Milovana, who says Russia is advancing in Ukraine like a hot knife through butter. Trump may get surprised how insignificant his initiative is. Fair point. Pavel, any questions that you've got, email me at the usual address, and I'll see if I can answer them for you. Kernio says debt for Ukraine and a future harvest for the empire. Fair point. Not a Pacifist says Monsanto and BlackRock must pay. Well, I would agree with you, but the only way that's going to happen ultimately is when the US working class overthrows the parasites in the US itself. Then they can nationalize the assets of Monsanto and BlackRock, which are considerable. And hello to David King, who says might ditch west parts of Poland. Hello to Arnold. The Russians have stated that 520,000 Ukrainians have been killed this year alone. That's the numbers stated by Belousov at the Ministry of Defense meeting, isn't it? Yeah, I need to look at those. Kernio says if the empire pulls out of Ukraine without a big war, it can mean it has accepted the end of their hegemony, but it seems not likely. Which is why I have my doubts about whether this negotiation is going to go anywhere. Do you think the American conservatives have more sympathy for Russia than China because they're white Christians? I'm from the South, and you can't overestimate American racism, nor British, in actual fact. It's less to do with that. It's more to do with the fact that some of these right-wing guys in the United States seem to genuinely buy like a lot of the branding that Putin and the others in the hierarchy have engaged in the way that they were trying to sell themselves as like potential partners to the West. The way they rebranded RT a few years ago from when Trump first came in, from being something which was more on the left, had a lot of left-wing commentators on it, not good ones, but they did have them on there, to being something which had like a lot of like pro-Trump reactionaries on there. And they were trying to sell Russia that way to like the pro-Trump crowd, that this was a traditionalist Christian nation, etc. Even though it's not, there's a lot of Christians in it. But you look at the difference between how the Russian state tries to sell itself to Europeans and Americans, and look at how the Russian state talks about itself in Russian. It's a lot different. This is the reason I don't go on RT anymore, is because their anchors were trying to push a very reactionary line in interviews that they kept doing with me, and I decided in the end I didn't want anything to do with it anymore. But then you look at the way Putin and the other senior leaders of Russia talk about Russia internally, being a nation of many faiths, being a nation of many different ethnicities who are united by being Russian. Again, it's got much more to do, as I've said many times, with the Soviet national policy, the Soviet policy on like national minorities and minority cultures, than it has with the Tsardom. The Tsardom wasn't like that at all. But due to the way that the Russian leaders try to brand themselves to appeal to reactionaries in the West, this is the image they try to sell. So there's something to what Alan says. It's more also to do with the fact that Russia is now selling itself as like a free market Christian. or like a model version of a capitalist Christian nation. And so a lot of like American reactionaries like that idea. And they also like the idea that Putin's one of those guys who did in the USSR, even though he played only a very minor role in it. His old boss, Sobchak, played a much more significant role. So there's a lot of it is down to that. If the Chinese had gone through the nightmare that the Russians went through with a counter-revolution and the asset stripping of the 90s and weren't as powerful and weren't the CPC wasn't in power anymore, then the attitude towards China will be different. So there's something in what you say, Alan. I'd say that there's a lot more to it than that, because again, like huge numbers of the Russian population aren't white and couldn't be considered to be. I mean, this is part of the reason why these dumb Ukrainian racists keep thinking they're facing North Koreans in the field, is because there's a lot of people from Central Asia and the Russian Far East in the Russian army, like millions. I mean, there's millions of Russians who, to the untrained eye, look like Koreans, and a lot of them are fighting in the special military operation. So some Dumbo Westerner looks at some drone footage and sees a guy who looks like he might be Korean and thinks, my God, the North Koreans are here. The immortal, invisible super soldiers who are so stealthy, they're not even there. They're here. We've just seen one. He's emerged on camera. So, yeah, there's the racism and the chauvinism is part of it. The way the Russian state has tried to sell itself in the West is part of it. And also the fact that China is still ruled over by the CPC is also part of it. Hello to Nikki. Hello to Off Debeen. Hello to Denver 2036. Giuliani is a 21st century Pinochet. He's not even that good. He's not even going to be that successful, but I get what you mean. Keel Jones says he was grown in a lab in Langley, just like Pete Buttigieg. I think it might actually be Pete Buttigieg with a beard on. Maybe they both work for McKinsey at some stage. Hello to Bishi. Alan Smith says they keep saying anti-imperialist Westerners don't understand the horrors of Assad, but presumably the ruling class Westerners do. So many terrible left-wing takes, like Venezuela. Look, if as I said in a comment on Twitter, if you are not leading with the fact that the principal contradiction is U.S. imperialism and all of its creations in all of these scenarios, if you're not foregrounding that, then you are going to get lost in a Trotskyite maze of like Rania Khalek has, like many other of these Western petty bourgeois leftists have, of trying to appease leftist opinion in the West and also try to keep a foot in the camp of anti-imperialism, end up pleasing nobody, end up probably storming off Twitter in a huff because you've done a full Varoufakis, basically. But yeah, so why on earth would anybody believe the bourgeois press of Britain or the United States when they start talking about the horrors of Assad? These are people who've made up loads of crap about the enemies of imperialism, like made up an infinite amount of garbage, and yet now we're supposed to believe that they're telling the truth. It just doesn't work. And not unless you turn your brain off, of course. Kernio says religions need to be emancipated from imperial shackles, that we need work on it also. If not, religion will be a tool of the empire. Well, that's true. Paul Smith says, my advice to Sahel African countries is not to trust any of the Gulf states. Yeah. Everybody should be aware of their role, which is that they might come with loads of money and loads of promises, but that money comes with a very large cost attached to it. Hello to Ash. Hello to Jeremy. Jeremy asks, I have a naive question about sanctions. How do they actually work? Planes and ships being prevented at the source or upon arrival or in transit? How is this so well enforced? Well, it's less to do with naval interceptions these days, though that does happen. The US has hijacked ships essentially on the high seas. it's more to do with the US control they had until 2022 over the international financial system. So yes, hijacking ships has been part of it in the past. Military blockades have been part of it in the past, but it's more to do with the fact that the US occupied such a central place in the global financial system. They were able to literally switch off people's access to it. So if you were, for instance, wanting to do business in Venezuela, the US, because it adopted such a comprehensive sanctions regime on Venezuela, it was not just sanctioning entities that did business in Venezuela. It was also sanctioning any entity that did business with them. So you got these like secondary sanctions. So what they did was they threatened to essentially freeze you out of using certain financial systems like the SWIFT system, which was like the one system used for settling international payments for a very long time. It's now being replaced thanks to the fact that they overdid their domination of it by trying to freeze more and more people out of it. So what they did was they were able to threaten different companies with such a large legal bill, because they also insisted that their justice system had jurisdiction anywhere, so that they could sue you anywhere. They could stop you doing business inside the United States. They could like restrict you doing business also, because the European Union is such a bunch of tame dogs. They could restrict you from doing business inside the EU. And most companies don't want to lose those markets and don't want to lose access to the SWIFT system. They don't want to lose access to being able to raise capital on the money markets of the United States or Britain. So, and then of course they don't want to lose access to Western financial institutions. That held firm until 2022. There were already processes in place to try and overcome that. But this is a big part of the reason why the sanctions were so effective. It's not so much that they were doing blockades around all these countries, because they don't have big enough navy to do that. It's that they made the price of doing business with sanctioned countries far too high for most countries and companies to bear. Now that's changing, because now there are alternative means of making payments. Now is the alternatives being set up to the SWIFT system. And now there's more countries who are going to be prepared to essentially be able, they'll be having to make a choice. They won't be able to keep a foot in both camps anymore. So more countries will be prepared to defy the US, which means that now the Russians are running this gigantic ghost tanker fleet, which, again, like one of the reasons why oil embargoes were effective for a long time wasn't that the British and the US were hijacking every oil tanker. They did some, but they couldn't do all of them. Was that the one place in the world for a long time you could actually get a ship insured was via the ship insurers of London, like Lloyd's. If they refused to insure you, then in business terms, for many decades, you were fucked, because there was nowhere else or very few other places you could go to get insurance. Now the British have basically fucked themselves out of that business by trying to sanction the Russians out of the oil game. So now there's alternative insurance centers being set up where you can get a ship insured. But for a long time, if there was an oil embargo on and you tried to break it, the US would basically give the nod to the British to withdraw your shipping insurance. Again, these are costs that can be prohibitive in terms of doing business. So it's become a more high-tech, less military dependent system that the US has constructed, but no less effective for a while, at least. Now it's becoming less effective because there's more and more countries who have seen through it and have just said, fuck it, we'll do business with the Russians anyway, and to hell with what the US says. And if you're big enough, like the Indians are, you can sign a big deal with the Russians where you essentially repackage Russian oil and sell it at a big markup and pocket a lot of money out of it. Or if you're Nicaragua and you're a government which is led by a leadership that is in, shall we say, permanent mobilization mode with the masses, then you can take the risk of bringing in the Russian meerkat, as they have, and basically tell the US to go fuck themselves, which is what they're doing now. Because the Nicaraguans, one of their successes was the fact that they've managed to make themselves close enough to achieving food sovereignty, which is part of the reason why the US is so hostile. So if you can grow all your own food, feed your own population, that's a big tool the US used to have against you, which they no longer have. And then you can do more deals with the Russians, develop more business connections that way, develop more of a tourism business with the Russians, get people over there spending money. And if slowly the US, by overusing the sanctions mechanism and also overusing, trying to freeze people out from using the dollar, they've ultimately, by choosing to try and freeze out somebody as big as the Russians from using the dollar, they've forced innovation into the system. And so they're forcing people to innovate around using the dollar. So all of the systems that the US was basing its domination on, a lot of them are electronic, a lot of them are non-military, and they've kind of run out of juice with them now. They're still effective to a degree, but now many countries, thanks to the US's absolute insistence on using these as weapons, has run out of rope. They are running out of time as well. Hello to the Wicked Witch of the Southeast, who comes to us from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Agricola says, regarding BRICS and the Gulf states, it was telling when Iran suggested bombing their assets in case Israel, US go outright war with Iran, partners in the new multipolar world. Iran knows very well. Yeah, they understand, or most of the senior Iranian leaders should understand very well what the hell the game is with the Gulf states. Paul Smith says the US would want the war in Ukraine to continue, so try and destabilize Russia. That's always been their aim. Yes, the question is not whether they want it to continue. Many of them do. The question is whether they can continue it for much longer. If their aim is also to provoke a war in Southeast Asia, if their aim is also to try and do some kind of provocation with Iran, the question is not what they want. The question is what they can do. Can they continue with the current course? Can they continue to support the war in Ukraine at the same level as they were earlier this year or last year? I don't think they can. So we're getting to the point where they have to choose. And that's what the Trump regime reflects. The fact that they're getting into a position where they will have to choose to go one way or the other. They cannot do both. Judith says, the resistance in Syria is organizing. Will Russia help them? Unclear at this stage. Will depend a lot on what relationship the Russians choose to have in Syria. There's talk of them negotiating with somebody over these bases. We'll have to see how that goes. Given that the somebody will be Erdogan and the Turkish regime, will they want to do that negotiation? Will they want to keep a presence there? Again, it's unclear at this stage. So there was talk the other day that they'd withdrawn their grain shipments to Syria. This was contradicted by a statement made by Ramzan Kadyrov, who put out a statement in Russian and in Arabic saying that the grain shipments will continue to Syria. So that says that they're going to try and stay there, perhaps, or in some form. But are they going to get involved with the resistance factions? Not openly, I don't think. They're going to, first of all, bargain with HTS, which is what? It is essentially a Turkish-run operation. So maybe they try to bargain with HTS, but over what? What are they bargaining with the Turks over? Keeping the bases, perhaps. That might be a motivation for some in the Russian hierarchy. Or do they just decide ultimately to get out? It's all unclear at this stage. Given the role of the US in Syria, to my mind, it is likely that some in the Syrian resistance will receive assistance from Russian special services somehow or another, given the US's presence there. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see how quickly the Syrian resistance organizes. We'll have to see what form it takes. Have to see what kind of bargaining the Russians are up to with the Erdogan regime. It's all too early to make a clear prediction as of yet. Bishy says, it's tragic what the US has done to Ukraine. I heard somewhere that Gagarin's capsule was built in the Ukrainian SSR. Yeah, I think you're right about that. Ukrainian SSR was the most, I think it was the most industrialized part of the old Union. And look what the comprador regimes there, like of Leonid Kuchma, Kravchuk, and others, Yushchenko, look what they all did. Asset stripped it and destroyed it and sold it to the West. I mean, there's no words that I can come up with that are damning enough for these people. The imperialists are bad enough, but the compradors are just absolutely disgusting. CJ Jackson says, if Russia is allowed to win the war, surely that signals the end of US imperialism. It signals a further weakening. That's for certain. I won't say it spells the end, because remember, they were weakened by their disastrous scuttling out of Afghanistan, which was meant to be a withdrawal, an orderly withdrawal, and maybe even with some influence of theirs remaining behind. It turned into a rout. They were still an imperialist power. They'll still be an imperialist power if this goes the way everybody now thinks it's going to go. It's just a question of they'll be weakened a little bit more, and then they'll try and do something else involving China or Iran, and that will end badly for them, and they'll be weakened a little bit more. And the question is, really, at what point is there a sizable revolt inside the United States itself? And I'm not just talking, another Luigi scenario. I'm talking about, is there a sizable domestic revolt of the US workers? Because that's what will start to really disintegrate things. So we'll have to see. Losing in Ukraine will be damaging. It won't be the end, though, and we shouldn't think that. Alistair says, or asks rather, do you think the Russians will be prepared to normalize relations with Europe while the US still has bases there? I don't think they will be able to. Because, again, go back and watch my discussion with the German comrades. The Europeans, principally the French and the Germans, maybe the Germans more than anybody else, they're as invested as the US in the anti-Russian project because they require the disintegration of Russia as much as the British and the Americans do. Yes, Scholz has been a little bit more publicly hesitant in his public pronouncements, but German imperialism requires the subjugation of Russia as much as the British and the US do. I don't know why they've been kind of getting away with it, which is why I was happy to do that discussion, because I think the role that the Germans have played with regard to Russia has been very duplicitous and very dirty, especially in the Merkel era and in the Schroeder era, of feigning friendship whilst also looking to cultivate a reliable comprador regime there that would serve German imperialist interests. So there's a lot of contradictions in Europe at the moment, but the Americans being there is a barrier to normalization. But let's not kid ourselves. Even if the US pulled out tomorrow, which would be fantastic if they did, the Germans and the French, particularly the Germans, though, would try to reestablish themselves, indeed are trying to reestablish themselves as an imperialist player in their own right. And I don't think they'll ultimately be successful, but we should bear in mind that the German ruling class requires the destruction of the Putin-led system and the subjugation of Russia as much as the US does. Maybe more, because, again, it's a traditional target for German imperialism going back over 100 years. Hello to Spurious Furious. Lim K says, or asks, can Western Europe reform itself to be worthy in Russia's eyes? Western Europe can only reform itself when the US influence has gone and the current ruling classes are overthrown. That's the only way they're going to be able to reform themselves. Hello to Beiju. Hello to you, comrade. And Nap says, anything to read on Syria? I tell you what, I'll post whatever I've got in the reference section of the Telegram group. Okay, going through. There we go. Is Jackson Hinkle still a thing? Asked Alexander Luchter. Don't know. Don't watch him. Don't care. Aziz says, what did Khalek say about Assad and Syria? She did a big both sides thing. And Breakthrough News, by the way, is a Trotskyite operation. It's founded by this guy, Brian Becker, from the Party of Socialism and Liberation, PSL, United States. PSL is a Trotskyite operation that essentially goes around trying to push people back into the Democratic Party by posturing in an ultra-left fashion sometimes, and then trying to lead people back into alliances with the DSA and ultimately the Democrats in the next minute. So this is the way. This is the game that the PSL play. Breakthrough News is essentially a PSL adjacent project, and most of the people they employ on there are very, very weak when it comes to actually fighting imperialism, actually drawing the correct conclusions about imperialism. That's why Khalek and others will go there and like both sides things. They'll do like loads of anti-Stalin stuff. It's like I saw Khalek the other day try to justify her sort of non-position by saying, oh, well, when we were fighting Hitler in World War II, we allied with Stalin because Hitler's the bigger monster. I mean, it's just fucking trot garbage, liberal garbage of the worst kind. It's not just her, of course, but like that entire fucking network is like just a Trotskyite mess. And everybody who's on it ends up being a Trotskyite mess. So there you go. Judith says, Vanessa Beeley says that Russia may move its bases to Libya. I heard that. I also heard that there had already moved bases to Libya, that they've already got some operation going down there. So they may not wish to hang on to what they've got there. Beiju says, inferior national bourgeois government can plunder its working class and hide it during war circumstances. Yeah, that's true. I mean, this is indeed what happened. I mean, if you look at the Chinese Revolution, first of all, Chiang Kai-shek had to have a gun pointed at his head to agree a common front with the communists, and even then was very uncommitted to it. I mean, this is the thing with like the reason why communists would agree to a front, a common front with the national bourgeois political forces, is first of all to combat the primary contradiction, which is of course the imperialists, the US imperialists and their allies, but also to relentlessly expose the national bourgeois. So if the national bourgeois says we're engaged in a war of defense against imperialism, but they carry on, looting and exploiting in the same old way, then this is why the communists must retain operational independence. Mao talks about that all the way through the 1930s. We want a common front with the bourgeois nationalists of the Kuomintang against the Japanese fascists, but we're going to retain operational independence, and we're not going to allow ourselves to essentially be subordinated by Chiang Kai-shek. We'll fight with them against Japanese imperialism if they're committed to doing so. What happens there is, of course, that the Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang leaders get exposed over and over again as being far more obsessed with fighting the communists than they are with fighting the Japanese. So, but the premise of your question, Beiju, there's truth in that, which is that a national bourgeois can continue to act in the same old way whilst crying out that they're engaged in an existential war. And if there's a strong communist presence there, then that can be exposed. And the masses can draw the appropriate conclusions if the communist presence there is strong enough, and if the education process that they're engaged in with the masses is far-reaching enough. Then again, the masses of any country will draw the appropriate conclusions from that. Okay. No, the PSL are about as Marxist-Leninist as the British Liberal Democrats. Lim K says, Russia will maintain its status quo the best it can in Syria purely on defense as for now, a vital point of stabilizing in the region. Alistair says, as a rule of thumb, the reliability of left video channels is in inverse proportion to its production values, which is why the production values here will stay rudimentary. It's not just because I don't have enough time to actually do high-scale production stuff myself. Okay. Alan says, I now think a person's position on Stalin says everything about their politics. Indeed, it does. Because when my position on Stalin was Trotsky, my politics were utter bollocks as well. But there you go. Okay. So we are at the near to midnight mark. We are hitting the midnight hour here. I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening, for this return to Q&A territory. I'll be back again tomorrow, probably going to be around about the same time. And we will be getting into the latest from Syria and the war in occupied Palestine tomorrow, back at 10:30 British time. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Thanks to Jenny, our moderator. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. And I will be back with you again tomorrow. Now it's time to throw you back over to the music.
Le Vietnam brûle et moi je hurle Mao Mao. Johnson rigole et moi je vole Mao Mao. Le napalm coule et moi je roule Mao Mao. Les villes crèvent et moi je rêve Mao Mao. Les putains crient et moi je ris Mao Mao. Le riz est fou et moi je joue Mao Mao. L'impérialisme dicte partout sa loi. La révolution n'est pas un dîner. La bomba est un tigre en papier. Les masses sont les véritables héros. Les ricains tuent et moi je mue Mao Mao. Les fous sont rois et moi je bois Mao Mao. Les bombes tonnent et moi je sonne Mao Mao. Les bébés fuient et moi je fuis Mao Mao. Les Russes mangent et moi je danse Mao Mao. Diable dénonce, je renonce Mao Mao.
C'est le petit livre rouge qui fait que tout enfin bouge.
La base de l'armée, c'est le soldat. Le vrai pouvoir est au bout du fusil. Les monstres seront tous anéantis. L'ennemi ne périt pas de lui-même. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao.
When I was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see at the Prince of Wales. He said to me, come and join the British Army. Tooraloo, they're looking for monkeys up at the zoo. It says, one, if I had a face like you, I'd join the British Army. Sarah Connon baked a cake and so for poor old Slattery sake, sure I threw myself into the lake pretending I was barmy. Tooraloo, tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army. Sergeant Healy went away and his wife got in the family way, and the only words that she could say was blame the British Army. Tooraloo, me curse upon the Labour Blue that took me darling boy from me to join the British Army. Corporal Sheen is a terrible note, just give him a couple of jars of stout and he bait the enemy with his mouth and save the British Army. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army.
Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die Vater trug durch die Not. Die Fahne ist niemals gefallen, so oft auch der Träger fiel. Sie weht heute über uns allen und zieht schon der Sehnsucht Ziel. Ich trage eine Fahne, das Rot der Arbeiter macht. Es hat die Arbeiterfahne bei Nacht mein Vater bewacht und hat sie mir früh übergeben, als Morgenrot stieg empor, dass wir sie zur Sonne heben, bei Tag in der Kampfbeschwur. Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die uns die Einheit gebot. Sie hat unsere Väter begleitet durch Tage und Nacht und Krieg. Drum vorwärts die Söhne erstreiten, so
Еще разик, еще раз, разовьем мы березу, разовьем мы кудряву. Ой да дай да, ой да дай да, разовьем мы кудряву.